He built an empire that made Seoul's tech elite bow their heads when he entered a room. He ran a billion-dollar conglomerate with the precision of a surgeon and the warmth of a scalpel. No one dared question him. No one dared stay close, either. Then his body betrayed him. 8 months after a devastating diagnosis stole the use of his legs and the steadiness of his hands, his assistant organized a birthday dinner, set a table for 20 in a penthouse overlooking Gangnam, sent invitations to 14 people, former colleagues, board members, people Hyun-woo Kang once considered allies. Not a single one showed up. But someone did arrive that night, a woman carrying 3 thermal boxes of comfort food she'd been hired to deliver. A woman who had no obligation to stay, no reason to care, no history with the man sitting alone in a wheelchair, staring at an empty table. She stayed anyway. What happened next didn't just change his birthday. It dismantled everything he thought he knew about strength, about pride, about what it means to be seen by someone who owes you nothing. This is their story. If you're new here, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever shown up for someone who didn't deserve it? Let's get into it. The penthouse smelled like sesame oil and fresh linen. Ji-hoon Park had spent 3 hours arranging the long dining table, 20 place settings, each one precise, each napkin folded into the same sharp crease. He'd ordered the good plates, the ones Hyun-woo kept for investors and government officials, the ones that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The playlist was loaded on the sound system, old jazz standards that Hyun-woo used to play in his corner office at Hong Kong Group when the building emptied out after midnight. Ji-hoon had worked for the man for 7 years. He knew things about Hyun-woo Kang that Hyun-woo probably didn't realize anyone had noticed, like the jazz, like the fact that he always read contracts from the last page forward, like the way his jaw tightened, just barely, just a flicker, whenever someone mentioned family. Ji-hoon had sent 14 invitations for tonight. March 15th, Hyun-woo's 35th birthday. Handwritten cards on heavy cream stock, because Ji-hoon understood that the gesture mattered as much as the ask. He'd sent them to former executives, to 3 board members who had once attended Hyun-woo's dinners without question, to the CFO who had worked beside him for 6 years, to the head of the Seoul Tech Association, who had once called Hyun-woo the most brilliant mind of his generation. Not one had confirmed. But Ji-hoon hoped. He hoped the way people hope when they already know the answer, but can't bring themselves to accept it. Stubbornly, irrationally, with a kind of desperate optimism that felt almost like grief. By 7 o'clock, the table was ready. The apartment gleamed. Ji-hoon stood by the kitchen island and waited. By 7:15, no one had arrived. By 7:20, he started checking his phone. No messages, no cancellations. Just silence, the loudest kind, the kind that says everything by saying nothing at all. Hyun-woo sat in his wheelchair near the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to the table. He hadn't asked for this party. He hadn't wanted it. But Ji-hoon had insisted with the quiet persistence that was his only form of rebellion. And Hyun-woo had allowed it the way he allowed most things Ji-hoon did, by not explicitly forbidding it, which in their 7-year dynamic was the closest thing to enthusiasm. He could see the reflection of the empty table in the glass. 20 settings, 20 clean plates catching the light, 20 chairs with no one in them. He didn't say anything. But Ji-hoon saw the reflection too, and the silence between them shifted from expectant to something heavier, something final. 8 months ago, Hyun-woo Kang had been untouchable, CEO of Hong Kong Group, a tech conglomerate that had reshaped Seoul's digital infrastructure. The kind of man whose name appeared in Forbes' Korea profiles, whose handshake could make or break a startup's future, whose approval was the rarest and most coveted currency in the industry. He worked 18-hour days. He expected the same from everyone around him. He once made a senior engineer redo a 200-page technical report because the margin widths were inconsistent. He canceled a product manager's honeymoon leave 48 hours before the flight because a quarterly review needed revision. He wasn't cruel. Or at least, he never thought of it that way. Cruelty requires awareness. Cruelty requires you to see the person in front of you and choose to hurt them anyway. Hyunwoo didn't see people. He saw functions. He saw output. He saw roles that either performed or didn't. And when they didn't, he replaced them with the same mechanical efficiency he applied to everything else in his life. He never learned the names of the assistants on other floors. He walked past the security guard at the lobby desk every morning for 4 years without once asking how the man's day was going. He had a driver for 6 years, and when the driver's mother died, Hyunwoo approved the bereavement leave request without looking up from his laptop. He wasn't a monster. He was something almost worse. He was indifferent. And indifference, unlike cruelty, doesn't leave bruises. It just leaves people feeling like they were never there at all. Then, in July of the previous year, his left foot went numb. He ignored it for a week. Then the right foot. Then his calves began tingling. A strange electric prickling that crawled up his legs like something was short-circuiting inside him. He ignored that too, because Hyunwoo Kang did not get sick. Sickness was a failure of discipline, and discipline was the only religion he'd ever practiced. By the time he finally saw a neurologist, only because his legs buckled during a board presentation, sending him to the floor in front of 11 people, the diagnosis came fast: Guillain-Barré syndrome. His immune system was attacking his peripheral nerves, stripping the myelin sheaths like wire being skinned. The signals from his brain were arriving at his muscles garbled, delayed, or not at all. Within 6 weeks, he was in a wheelchair. His legs were gone. His hands, those precise, commanding hands that had signed billion-won contracts and pointed accusingly at underperforming charts, now trembled. Some days they cooperated. Most days they didn't. The doctors talked about recovery. Guillain-Barré wasn't permanent, they said. Most patients recovered significant function, but the timeline was uncertain. Months, possibly years. Some patients plateaued. Some regressed before improving. There were no guarantees, only probabilities. And probabilities had never been enough for a man who demanded certainty from the universe the way he demanded it from his employees. The board moved quickly. Donghyun Seo, the vice president who had spent 5 years smiling in Hyunwoo's shadow while quietly sharpening his own ambitions, led the charge. Within 2 months, Hyunwoo was transitioned to a Ganton senior consultative role, a title with no power, no vote, and no office. His access badge was deactivated, his parking space reassigned. His name remained on the letterhead because removing it required a shareholder vote, and even Donghyun understood the optics of erasing a disabled founder. The colleagues who had once competed for his approval vanished. The executives who had attended his dinners, who had laughed at his rare jokes with the desperate enthusiasm of people trying to stay in a powerful man's good graces, they evaporated, not with hostility, with something worse, indifference, the same indifference he had shown them for years, reflected back at him with perfect, devastating symmetry. Now it was March, 8 months since the diagnosis. 8 months in this penthouse, in this wheelchair, in this body that had become a cage. Ji-hoon came every day. The physiotherapist came 3 times a week. The neurologist came monthly. His mother called from Busan on Sundays. He told her the recovery was going well, that he was walking short distances, that the company was running smoothly under his guidance. Every word a lie, delivered in the steady, controlled voice of a man who had spent his entire adult life performing competence. And now, on his 35th birthday, 20 empty chairs confirmed what he had refused to admit. Fear is not loyalty. Obedience is not love. And when the thing people feared was gone, there was nothing left to keep them in the room. At 7:30, the intercom buzzed. Ji-hoon's head snapped up. For one desperate second, hope flared in his chest. Someone had come. Someone had read the invitation and felt something. Anything. Delivery from home plate. I have 3 thermal boxes for this address. The voice was warm, practical, and completely unfamiliar. Ji-hoon closed his eyes for a beat. Then he buzzed her up. Zuri Mitchell stepped out of the elevator carrying 3 insulated containers stacked in a professional carrier, her jacket still damp from the March drizzle outside, She'd been running deliveries since 4 that afternoon, a corporate lunch in Uedo, a birthday prep for a family in Mapo Gu, and now this, a catering order for 20 at a Gangnam penthouse. The order had come in 3 days ago. Specific requests. Comfort food with Korean fusion elements. She'd built the menu herself. Fried chicken with a gochujang honey glaze, mac and cheese with roasted kimchi folded through the bechamel, cornbread with yuzu honey butter, collard greens braised with doenjang and sesame, 4 hours of cooking, 6 containers, enough food for a party. The elevator opened directly into the foyer, and the first thing she noticed was the silence. Not the comfortable silence of a room waiting to fill up, but the tight, pressurized silence of a room that had already accepted its emptiness. The second thing she noticed was the table. Long, formal, beautiful, set for 20. Every plate untouched, every glass empty. Ji-hoon met her at the entrance. His eyes were red, not crying, further along than crying. That hollow, dried-out look of someone who had processed the hurt and arrived at exhaustion. "You can set up on the kitchen island. The table's taken." The words came with a small, broken, almost laugh, and Zuri understood immediately. She'd been in Seoul for 3 years. She'd built Homeplate from savings and stubbornness, and the kind of bone-deep belief in the power of feeding people that had been bred into her since childhood. She'd catered celebrations and commiserations, baby showers and breakups. She knew what an empty party looked like. She carried the containers to the island and began unpacking without comment. She arranged the food with the care she gave every delivery, not because the circumstances required it, but because that was the standard. The chicken in its serving tray, the mac and cheese in the ceramic dish she'd brought, the cornbread cut into even squares. While she worked, she saw the man by the window, wheelchair, still posture, watching Seoul's skyline like it owed him something. He hadn't acknowledged her entrance, hadn't turned around, hadn't moved. She finished setting up, wiped down the counter, folded the insulated bags. By every professional standard, her job was done. She could leave. She should leave. Instead, she walked toward the dining area, stopping a respectful distance from the wheelchair. "Have you eaten today?" The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then Hyunwoo turned his head, just enough to acknowledge her existence without fully granting it. "I don't need pity from the caterer." His voice was low, controlled, edged with the kind of precision that people use when they're trying to cut someone without raising their volume. It was the voice of a man who had once ended careers with a single sentence delivered in exactly that tone. Zuri didn't flinch. She'd grown up the youngest of 4 in Atlanta, raised by a grandmother who could silence a room with a look, and who believed that rudeness was a symptom, not a diagnosis. She'd survived the loneliness of being a foreigner, building a life in a country where she'd always be visibly different. She'd weathered a relationship that had dragged her across an ocean and then crumbled. A man in a wheelchair with a sharp tongue was not going to be the thing that rattled her. "It's not pity. You paid for the food. I'm asking if you've tried it." Another silence. Longer this time. Then, without looking at her directly, a slight exhale, not quite dismissal, not quite surrender. "You can go." She went. Not because he told her to, but because she recognized a person who had used up every scrap of composure they had and was holding on by sheer, stubborn pride. Pushing further wouldn't be kindness. It would be spectacle. She said goodnight to Ji-hoon at the elevator. He thanked her quietly, with the tired gratitude of someone who had been carrying weight alone for too long. On the ride down, Zuri thought about the table. 20 place settings, not a single plate used. The food she'd spent 4 hours making, sitting on an island in a penthouse where nobody came. She thought about the man by the window, the rigid line of his shoulders, the control in his voice, control that wasn't strength, but the last wall standing in a building that had already collapsed inside. She went home, fed her cat, washed the delivery bags, and planned tomorrow's menu. She did not think about him again that night. But she would, later, remember the silence of that apartment with a clarity that surprised her. The way you remember the exact temperature of a room where something important happened, even before you understood what it was. Hyun-woo ate at 11 that night, alone, after Ji-hoon had gone home. He wheeled himself to the island and uncovered the containers one by one. The chicken was still warm in its insulated tray. The mac and cheese had that golden crust on top. The cornbread broke apart in his unsteady hands, crumbling onto the plate, and he ate the crumbs too. It was the best meal he'd had in 8 months, not because of the technique or the ingredients, although both were exceptional. Because someone had made it with attention, with thought, with the invisible, unmeasurable thing that separates food, that nourishes from food that simply fills. He hated that it mattered. He hated that on his 35th birthday, alone in a penthouse that cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime, the only moment that had felt human was a stranger asking if he'd eaten. He ate every bite, and when he was done, he sat at the island for a long time, staring at the empty containers, feeling something he couldn't name and didn't want to examine. Ji-hoon started ordering from home plate 3 times a week. He didn't ask Hyun-woo's permission, because asking would have prompted a refusal. And Ji-hoon had learned years ago that the most effective way to manage Hyun-woo Kang was through strategic omission. He simply placed the orders, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and left the food on the kitchen island with the containers labeled and the heating instructions tucked underneath. Hyun-woo never mentioned it, never thanked him, never acknowledged that the food existed. But every container came back empty, scraped clean, the lids replaced neatly, which, from a man who once left dirty coffee cups on Ji-hoon's desk without a word, was practically a standing ovation. By the 3rd week, Zuri started delivering in person. She told herself it was logistical. The Gangnam penthouse was on her route, or close enough to her route that the detour was negligible. And the apartment building's concierge was particular about delivery protocols, so it was easier to bring it up herself than to brief one of the contract drivers on the access codes. These were reasonable explanations. They were also, she knew, not the real reason. The real reason was simpler and harder to admit. She was curious. Not about the money or the penthouse or even the wheelchair. About the silence. About a man who sat alone in a room designed for company and refused to acknowledge that the emptiness meant anything. The first few deliveries were brief. Ji-hoon answered the door. Zuri handed off the food. 30 seconds. Professional, clean. Then Ji-hoon started being conveniently absent. A pharmacy run. A call he had to take in the other room. A dry cleaning pickup that couldn't wait. The timing was suspicious, and the excuses were transparent. And Zuri saw exactly what he was doing, engineering proximity between her and the man in the wheelchair. And she let him do it, because she understood the impulse. Ji-hoon was worried about his boss, and worry him when it has nowhere to go, starts building doors. The interactions at the door stretched. 30 seconds became 2 minutes. 2 minutes became 10. Not because of warmth. Hyun-woo was about as warm as a January sidewalk, but because he was interesting in the way that difficult, complicated, prickly people are interesting when you're not afraid of them. He tested her constantly. Sarcasm was his native language, and he deployed it with the fluency of someone who had used it as both weapon and armor his entire life. He criticized the food. Too much salt. The chicken was dry. The cornbread was dense, with the clinical detachment of a restaurant reviewer who wanted you to know that nothing you did could possibly impress him. Zuri didn't argue. She didn't defend. She also didn't absorb it, which was the thing that seemed to confuse him most. When he was rude, she named it. That was rude. Try again. 4 words, delivered without heat, without hurt, without the submissive softening that he was used to receiving from people who were afraid of him. The correction landed the way a mispronunciation gets corrected, factually, without judgment, as though rudeness was simply an error in execution that could be fixed with better data. He didn't know what to do with her. Every interaction he'd had for the past decade operated on a clear power dynamic. He had it, they didn't, and the relationship was defined by that imbalance. But Zuri didn't work for him, didn't want anything from him, didn't owe him deference or patience or any of the small courtesies that people extend to the powerful in exchange for proximity to that power. She was simply there, consistently, without agenda. And the consistency was doing something to him that he couldn't control, which meant it frightened him, which meant he pushed harder. One Tuesday in early April, not a delivery day, Zuri's phone rang. Jihoon's name. He won't eat. 3 days. I've tried everything. He threw a plate. Jihoon's voice was careful, measured, the way people sound when they're trying very hard not to sound desperate. Zuri heard the edges of it anyway. I'm not his nurse, Jihoon. I know. I'm not asking you to be. I'm asking you to bring food. That's what you do. She brought food. Let herself in with the code Jihoon texted. Found Hyunwoo in the living room, wheelchair angled away from the door, rigid with the particular fury of a man whose body had done something his mind hadn't authorized. She later learned the trigger. His neurologist had adjusted his prognosis that morning. The recovery wasn't tracking as expected. The nerves were regenerating, but slowly, slower than the models predicted. A plateau, the doctor called it. Could last weeks, could last months, could become permanent. She didn't ask what was wrong. She unpacked the food on the coffee table in front of him instead of the kitchen island, because making him wheel across the apartment would have been a power move. And power moves weren't what this moment needed. Japchae, with hand-pulled sweet potato noodles, braised short ribs that fell apart if you looked at them too firmly, steamed rice with a salted egg yolk buried in the center like a secret. She sat in the chair across from him and ate her own portion. Not facing him, perpendicular, close enough to be present, angled enough to not be confrontational. She didn't speak, she ate. The silence between them shifted from hostile to something adjacent to companionable. Not there yet, but approaching the neighborhood. He ate. Not much, but he ate. And when she packed up the containers, he spoke without looking at her. The short ribs were acceptable. From Hyunwoo Kang, this was the equivalent of a 5-star review. The deliveries became something else after that. Not visits, exactly. Neither of them would have used that word. But the professional boundary that had kept the interactions clean and transactional began to blur at the edges. The way watercolors bleed when the paper gets wet. Zuri started staying. 5 minutes after drop-off became 15. 15 became an hour. They talked, or rather, she talked, and he responded with the grudging participation of a man who was starving for conversation but would rather die than admit it. She told him about home plate, how she'd come to Seoul on a culinary scholarship 3 years ago, 26 and terrified, with a suitcase full of her grandmother's recipes and a relationship that was supposed to be the anchor but turned out to be the storm. How the relationship had ended 8 months after she arrived. He went back to the States. She stayed. Not because Seoul was easy, but because leaving would have meant the whole thing was a failure. And Zuri Mitchell did not accept failure as a final answer. She told him about Amma, her assistant, her business partner, her only real friend in the city. Nigerian, mid-30s, brutally honest, the kind of woman who would tell you your food was terrible while eating a second helping. They'd met at a weekend cooking class in Ida 1 and recognized each other instantly. Not as friends, but as fellow survivors. 2 women building lives in a country that hadn't been designed for them. Finding joy anyway. Stubbornly, defiantly, 1 meal at a time. In return, Hyunwoo offered fragments. Not confessions. He wasn't built for confessions. But pieces. The way an archaeologist finds shards and infers the whole vessel. He mentioned his mother in Busan. The way he'd grown up watching her work 3 jobs after his father died when Hyunwoo was 9. The silent vow he'd made at the funeral. That he would never be powerless again. That he would build something so large and so unassailable that the world could never take anything from him the way it had taken his father. And then the world took your legs. Zuri said it simply, without cruelty, without pity. Just the fact, laid on the table between them like another dish to be shared. Hyunwoo looked at her for a long time. Then, very quietly, with the voice of a man admitting something he had never said aloud. Yes. A week later, she arrived for a delivery and found him at the dining table, the long one, the one with 20 chairs, trying to sign documents. His hands were shaking. The pen skittered across the page like a seismograph during an earthquake. He tried again. The signature came out garbled, unrecognizable, a mockery of the decisive, commanding strokes that had once authorized mergers and terminated careers. He tried a third time. The pen dropped, rolled across the table. He reached for it and his arm didn't extend far enough, his fingers closing on air, and the pen kept rolling until it fell off the edge and hit the floor with a small, stupid, devastating click. He didn't scream, didn't curse. That would have been easier. Rage is a release, and release implies somewhere for the pain to go. Instead, he went still. Perfectly, terrifyingly still. His jaw locked. His eyes burned but didn't spill. He sat in the wreckage of his own body and held everything inside with the kind of rigid control that isn't strength. It's the moment before a dam breaks. Zuri saw all of it. She didn't console him, didn't touch him, didn't offer any of the well-meaning platitudes that people deploy when they're uncomfortable with someone else's pain and want it to stop for their own sake. She pulled out the chair beside him and sat down. Close. Quiet. Present. She waited. The silence lasted maybe 2 minutes, maybe 5. Time does strange things in moments like that. It thickens, becomes almost physical, a medium you move through rather than a current that carries you. When his breathing steadied, and the rigidity in his shoulders softened from stone to something merely tense, she spoke. I can hold the paper while you sign, if you want. Practical. Specific. Not son, let me help you. Which is about the helper. Not, it's okay. Which is a lie. Just an offer. A concrete thing. A door he could walk through or not. He looked at her. Really looked. Maybe for the first time since she'd started coming to the penthouse. Not past her. Not through her. Not at the category she represented. Delivery person, stranger, interruption. At her. The actual human sitting in the chair beside him, offering to hold a piece of paper so he could sign his name. Okay. She held the paper flat with both hands. He picked up the pen from where she'd retrieved it from the floor. His hand shook, but less, whether from the steadiness of the paper or from something else. Neither of them examined. He signed. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't the signature of the man he used to be. But it was legible. And it was his. And for the first time in 8 months, he had accepted help without feeling like he was losing something. The deliveries became dinners. Shared ones. Zuri brought enough for 2 and stayed. They ate at the kitchen island, not the long table. That table was a monument to absence, and neither of them wanted to sit in its shadow. The conversations deepened the way conversations do between 2 people who have seen each other in unguarded moments and chosen to stay anyway. He told her about the kind of boss he'd been, not with pride, not with shame, with the bewildered honesty of a man examining his own life from a wheelchair and seeing it clearly for the first time. I made a woman redo a report because the headers were in the wrong shade of blue. Not the wrong blue. The wrong shade. She had a newborn at home. I didn't know. I didn't ask. Zuri listened. Chewed. Swallowed. So you were a terrible boss. The words landed with a soft, clean thud. No padding, no softening. And instead of the defensive wall he would have erected a year ago. The justifications about standards, about excellence, about the sacrifices required to build something that mattered. Something unexpected happened. He laughed. It was an ugly laugh. Unpracticed, rusty at the hinges, like a door that hadn't been opened in years. It surprised them both. Zuri's eyebrows lifted, and Hyunwoo's hand went to his mouth as though he could catch it and push it back in. But it was real. The first real laugh in months. And realness, once it breaks through, is very hard to seal back up. That night, after Zuri left, Hyunwoo sat in the kitchen for a long time. He noticed something he'd missed. A small note tucked under the lid of the japchae container, in handwriting that was confident and slightly messy. Turmeric in the broth today. Good for nerve inflammation. Don't tell anyone I'm sneaking vegetables into your life. She'd been researching his condition, adapting the food, anti-inflammatory ingredients, omega-3 rich proteins, turmeric, ginger, foods that supported nerve regeneration. She hadn't mentioned it, hadn't made a production of it. Just done it, quietly. The way you care for someone when the caring isn't a performance. He held the note in his unsteady hand and stared at it until the words blurred. Not from tears, from something older and deeper than tears. The slow, terrifying recognition that someone was paying attention to him. Not to his title, not to his net worth, not to the empire he'd built and lost. To him, the actual, broken, difficult, frightened person underneath all of it. He wasn't ready for that. He wasn't sure he'd ever be ready for that. But the note stayed on his bedside table, and he read it again in the morning, and again the next night, and it was still there a week later, the paper softening at the edges from being handled too many times by hands that couldn't quite hold on. The problem with walls is that they don't distinguish between threats and gifts. They keep everything out. The things that would destroy you, and the things that might save you, with the same blind, indiscriminate efficiency. Hyunwoo had spent 35 years building walls. He was very, very good at it. And now that something was getting through, every instinct he had screamed to build them higher. May arrived in Seoul with the weight of blossoms and the particular golden light that makes the city look like it was designed to be photographed. Inside the penthouse, the light hit the empty dining table every afternoon at 4 and turned the unused plates into small, accusing mirrors. Two things happened in the same week that cracked the equilibrium Hyunwoo and Zuri had built. The first was Dong-hyun Seo. He arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, unannounced, which was itself a power move. A man who once would have requested a meeting through Ji-hoon 2 weeks in advance now simply showed up, accompanied by 2 board members whose names Hyunwoo recognized, but whose faces had become interchangeable in his memory. They wore concern the way politicians wear flag pins, visibly, strategically, with no actual connection to the thing it represents. The visit lasted 40 minutes. The language was careful. Restructuring, fiduciary responsibility, shareholder confidence, health-focused transition. Underneath the corporate vocabulary, the message was simple. Sell your shares. Step down formally. Let us erase you from the thing you built. We want what's best for you, Hyunwoo. You should be focusing on recovery, not quarterly projections. Dong-hyun delivered the line with a smile that had been rehearsed in front of a mirror. Hyunwoo saw through it the way you see through glass, completely, effortlessly, with a clarity that offered no comfort, because the thing on the other side was uglier than the barrier. He didn't fight. Not because he agreed, but because fighting required energy. And energy was a finite resource that his body was spending on things like keeping his lungs working and his heart beating. The board members left with nothing signed, but also nothing refused. A strategic ambiguity that Dong-hyun would interpret as weakness, and Hyunwoo was too tired to correct him. Zuri arrived 20 minutes after they left. She carried the usual containers, but she stopped in the foyer because the air in the apartment was different. Charged, pressurized, the emotional equivalent of a room where someone has been screaming silently. Ji-hoon was washing 3 coffee cups in the kitchen. His movements were tight, controlled, angry. Who was here? Ji-hoon didn't answer, but his eyes flicked toward the living room, where Hyunwoo sat in his wheelchair with the stillness of a man who had just been measured for a coffin by people pretending to bring flowers. She set up the food, ate with him in the usual spot. He was more silent than usual. Not the combative silence of early weeks, but a tired silence, the kind that comes from being outmaneuvered and knowing it. She didn't push. As she packed up to leave, she asked one question. The men who were here, are they helping you or handling you? Hyunwoo's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The second thing that happened was quieter, but seismically more dangerous. On Friday night, Zuri was at the penthouse later than usual. She'd brought a new recipe, a Korean Southern fusion she'd been developing, sweet potato gnocchi with a gochugaru brown butter, and the conversation had wandered further than it usually did. Past the safe territories of food and work and surface-level history, into the darker, softer places. She told him about her grandmother, the woman who had raised her after her mother left, who had taught her that feeding people was the most honest form of love, who had died 3 years ago, just weeks before Zuri boarded the plane to Seoul. I didn't get to cook her last meal. I think about that sometimes. What I would have made, whether she would have tasted the goodbye in it. The room held the words the way a cupped hand holds water, carefully, aware that any movement would spill them. Hyun-woo, for the first time in their acquaintance, didn't respond with deflection or sarcasm. He sat with what she'd said, let it exist between them without trying to fix it or minimize it or redirect it. And then, because the silence had made a space and he didn't know how to leave it empty, he told her about his father. He was a bus driver, Route 17, Busan to Ulsan. He did the same route for 22 years. When he died, they reassigned the route the next day, 22 years, and the only evidence he'd existed was a schedule change. He'd never told anyone that. Not Ji-hoon, not the therapist the hospital had sent during the early weeks of his diagnosis, not the handful of women he'd dated over the years in relationships that were more like mergers, strategic, time-limited, emotionally leveraged. He'd never said it aloud because saying it aloud would make it true, and the truth of it, that his entire career had been an attempt to become so significant that the world couldn't reassign him, was the kind of self-knowledge that dismantles you. Zuri reached across the space between them. Not far. Just enough to rest her hand on the arm of his wheelchair, near his hand but not touching it. An offering. A proximity. A permission. He moved his hand, shakily, slowly, until his fingers covered hers. The contact was light, unsteady, electric in the way that first touches are when they've been delayed by months of wanting and weeks of fear. They stayed like that, not speaking. The city hummed 23 stories below them, and the gnocchi cooled on the counter, and for a suspended, impossible moment, everything that was wrong, the wheelchair, the diagnosis, the empty chairs, the men who wanted to erase him, all of it went quiet. Then the moment ended. Not with a sound, but with a thought, his thought. The one that had been circling like a vulture since the first time she'd made him laugh. She's going to see you get worse. She's going to watch your hands stop working entirely. She's going to be here when you can't feed yourself, can't dress yourself, can't transfer from this chair to the bed without help. And one day, she's going to leave, because everyone leaves. And it will be worse, immeasurably, catastrophically worse, because she will have been the one who stayed longest. He pulled his hand back. Zuri felt the withdrawal before she felt the absence of contact. It wasn't physical. It was atmospheric. Like a door closing in another room. She looked at him. He was already somewhere else. Behind a wall she could see but couldn't reach. A week later, the wall became a weapon. Zuri arrived on Monday with the delivery. Hyun-woo was in the living room. Ji-hoon was not conveniently absent. He was just absent. Something in the air felt rehearsed. You don't need to keep coming here. His voice was different, not angry, precise, surgical. The voice of the CEO who had once dismantled partnerships and dismissed executives and restructured entire divisions with the same calm, lethal clarity. He'd been saving this voice, keeping it in reserve for the moment when it was needed most, the moment when something got close enough to hurt him. I appreciate the food. Your business does good work. But you've confused professional service with personal invitation. I'm a client. That's the arrangement. Let's not complicate it. Each sentence was placed like a chess piece, deliberate, devastating. He called her The delivery girl, not to her face as a term of address, but woven into the dismissal, casual, reductive, designed to shrink the 3 months they'd built into something transactional and forgettable. Ji-hoon will handle the orders going forward. You can send a driver. Zuri stood in the doorway holding a container of braised short ribs that she'd spent 2 hours cooking because she knew they were his favorite, because she paid attention, because that's what caring looks like when it's not a performance. And she felt every word land exactly where he'd aimed them. She didn't argue, didn't plead, didn't cry, although the burning behind her eyes was fierce and immediate and took every ounce of control she had to contain. She set the container on the island, picked up her bag. At the door, she stopped, turned back. Not to fight, to say the one thing that needed to be said before the door closed. You're not protecting yourself, Hyunwoo. You're just making sure that when you look around and no one's there, you can tell yourself it was your choice. She left. The elevator doors closed. She made it to her car before the tears came, hot, angry. The tears of a woman who had offered something genuine to someone who had chosen to throw it back, rather than risk holding it. In the penthouse, Hyunwoo sat in the silence he had demanded and felt it settle over him like a burial shroud. He had gotten exactly what he asked for. The cruelest thing about self-sabotage is that it works. The food still came. Monday, Wednesday, Friday. The schedule Ji-hoon had established, maintained with the mechanical reliability of a system that no longer had a soul. A different driver each time. The containers arrived labeled in Zuri's handwriting, but the notes were gone. No turmeric reminders, no gentle teasing. Just the food, the heating instructions, and the invoice. Hyunwoo ate. The food was identical. The same recipes, the same quality, the same care baked into every component. But eating it alone was different from eating it with her the way a house is different from a home. The same structure, the same walls, entirely different in every way that matters. May bled into June. The cherry blossoms fell and were swept away. Seoul shifted into the heavy, humid prelude to monsoon season, and the penthouse windows fogged with condensation that Hyunwoo watched form and dissolve like small, temporary worlds. His condition didn't improve. The plateau held, neither better nor worse, which the neurologist described as stable, with the careful optimism of a doctor who knows that stagnation and stability are only the same thing on paper. His hands still trembled. His legs remained useless. The physiotherapy sessions continued 3 times a week, painful, exhausting, yielding gains measured in millimeters that felt like miles and still weren't enough. The absence of Zuri was not something he acknowledged. Not to Ji-hoon, who watched his employer with the quiet, worried attention of a man who has seen a building's foundation crack and is waiting for the structure to follow. Not to himself, in the long hours between midnight and dawn when the penthouse was at its most honest, and the loneliness was a physical presence, heavy and cold, sitting in every chair, occupying every empty space. He told himself it was necessary, that he had done the right thing. That attachment was a liability, and vulnerability was a weapon others would use against him. Hadn't the board proven that? Hadn't the empty birthday table proven that? People stay when you're useful. They leave when you're not. The only variable is timing. The logic was impeccable. The logic was also the loneliest sound in the world. 3 weeks after Zuri stopped coming, Ji-hoon broke 7 years of professional silence. It happened on a Thursday evening, unremarkable in every external way. Hyunwoo was at the kitchen island, eating alone, the containers arranged with the precision of a man who has replaced human connection with routine. Ji-hoon was organizing the next day's medical appointments on his tablet. The jazz playlist was on. It was always on now, filling the apartment with sound the way you'd fill a cavity with packing material, not to fix it, but to keep it from collapsing. Ji-hoon set down the tablet, straightened his posture, and spoke with a clarity that surprised them both. You did this to everyone. Hyunwoo's hand stopped, a piece of cornbread halfway to his mouth. 7 years, I watched you. You made people feel small. Not with cruelty. You were never cruel. And honestly, That might have been easier. Cruelty is at least personal. You made people feel invisible, like they were furniture that happened to have a pulse. And when they left, and they always left, you told yourself it proved your theory, that people are unreliable, that the only safe investment is the one you control completely. That loneliness is just another word for independence. Hyunwoo set down the cornbread. His jaw was tight. The temperature in the room had dropped by several degrees without the thermostat moving. Ji-hoon. A warning. The voice that had ended conversations and careers for a decade. But Ji-hoon had crossed a line he'd been standing behind for 7 years, and crossing back wasn't possible anymore. And now you did it to her. The one person who wasn't here because of a paycheck or a power structure or an obligation. She came because she wanted to. She stayed because she saw you. Not the CEO, not the chair, not the diagnosis. You. And you threw that away because you're more afraid of being loved than of being alone. The silence that followed was enormous. It filled the room the way water fills a sinking ship. Completely. Inexorably. Leaving no air pockets, no escape. Hyunwoo did not respond. Not because he had nothing to say, but because everything Ji-hoon had said was true. And the truth, when it arrives all at once like that, doesn't leave room for rebuttal. It just sits there, in the center of your chest, heavy and immovable, waiting for you to stop fighting it. Ji-hoon picked up his tablet, resumed scheduling. The professionalism settled back over him like a coat, but the words stayed in the room, reverberating in frequencies that neither of them could unhear. That night, Ji-hoon did something he had never done in 7 years of service. He called Busan. Soonja Kang answered on the second ring. She always answered on the second ring, because the first ring was for hoping it was her son, and the second ring was for accepting that it probably wasn't. Ji-hoon told her everything. The real diagnosis, not the sanitized version Hyunwoo had been feeding her for 8 months. The wheelchair. The hands. The prognosis, uncertain, open-ended. A question mark where her son kept insisting there was a period. The empty birthday. The board maneuvering to push him out. And the woman. The woman who had arrived with food and left with something of Hyunwoo's that he hadn't meant to give, and who he had driven away because receiving it back would have required a vulnerability he couldn't afford. Soonja listened. When Ji-hoon finished, the line was silent for 10 seconds. I'll be there tomorrow. She arrived in Seoul on the 9 a.m., KTX from Busan, 12 hours from phone call to doorstep. She was 62 years old, 5 feet 2 inches of compressed fury and love, carrying a single overnight bag, and the particular expression of a Korean mother who has just discovered that her child has been lying to her for 8 months. The confrontation was not loud. It was worse than loud. Then, she stood in the living room of the penthouse, a space that cost more than every apartment she had ever lived in, combined, and looked at her son in his wheelchair. And she did not cry about the wheelchair. She did not cry about the diagnosis or the prognosis or the trembling hands. She cried because he had hidden it. You didn't protect me, Hyunwoo. You stole from me. You stole my right to be your mother. You decided, alone, the way you decide everything alone, that I couldn't handle it, that I was something to be managed, like your employees, like your board, like everyone else you've ever kept at arm's length because letting them closer might mean they'd see you need them. She stood over him, this tiny, fierce woman, and her voice didn't waver. You are my son, my only child, and you let me call every Sunday and believe you were getting better while you sat in this apartment, alone, unable to sign your own name. What gave you the right? What made you think that was love? Hyunwoo broke. Not the controlled, contained fracture of a man who allows himself a moment of weakness before reassembling. A real break. The kind that happens when the thing you've been holding together with pride and willpower and the sheer, stubborn refusal to be human finally exceeds the structural limits of what one person can carry alone. He cried. In front of his mother, in the penthouse that had become his prison, in the wheelchair that had become his identity. He cried with the graceless, full-body sobs of a person who has been saving them for 8 months and can't hold them anymore. His hands shook. His shoulders heaved. He couldn't wipe his own face because his hands wouldn't cooperate. And his mother wiped it for him, gently, with the hem of her sleeve, the way she had when he was small. She stayed. Of course she stayed. She installed herself in the guest room with the immovable determination of a woman who has made a decision and considers the matter closed. She cooked, not the refined fusion of Zuri's menu, but the dense, uncompromising comfort food of a Korean mother on a mission. Doenjang jjigae thick enough to stand a spoon in, kimchi jjigae that burned going down and healed something on the way. Rice cooked in an old pot she'd brought from Busan because she didn't trust the fancy rice cooker in his kitchen. She reorganized his medication schedule, argued with his physiotherapist about technique, called his neurologist, and asked questions for 40 minutes while Hunwoo sat beside her, simultaneously mortified and more loved than he'd felt in years. And between the cooking and the reorganizing and the medical advocacy, she asked about the woman. Ji-hoon had told her. Of course Ji-hoon had told her. Ji-hoon had told her everything, because Ji-hoon was, as it turned out, not just an assistant but a person with opinions and feelings and a moral compass that had finally overridden 7 years of professional restraint. Hyunwoo told his mother the rest. Sitting at the kitchen island, not the long table, never the long table, he described Zuri in terms that were careful, measured, and completely transparent in their inadequacy. He talked about the food, the notes, the way she named his rudeness without absorbing it, the pen, the paper, the hand she'd held during the episode, the cornbread note he still kept on his bedside table, and the way he'd ended it, surgically, deliberately, with words designed to make her leave before she could leave on her own. Saying it aloud was different from thinking it. When you think something, you can edit it, reshape it, add justifications and context, and the soft padding of rationalization. But when you say it aloud, to your mother, in a quiet kitchen in the late afternoon, the words come out stripped of all that. Just the bare, undecorated truth. I found someone who saw me, and I sent her away because being seen is the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced. And I've experienced my own body shutting down. Soonja listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then the words came quietly, without looking at him, while her hands moved through dishes in the sink. Your father was a proud man, too. Pride kept him on that bus route for 22 years when he should have gone back to school, should have asked for help, should have told me he was sick before it was too late. Pride told him that needing people was weakness, and pride killed him. Not the cancer, the silence. She dried her hands on a towel, turned to face her son. I will not watch the same thing happen twice. It took 5 more days. 5 days of his mother's cooking and his mother's honesty, and Ji-hoon's quiet, steady presence and the slow, grinding work of a man dismantling the architecture of his own isolation, brick by brick, in the only way available to him, not with grand gestures, but with small, daily choices to be present, to be honest, to let the people in the room actually be in the room. On the 6th day, he told Ji-hoon to bring the car. This was tectonic. Hyunwoo had not left the penthouse voluntarily in 5 months. The wheelchair in public, the stairs, the pity, the vulnerability of being at eye level with strangers, wastes, was a humiliation he had chosen to avoid by never confronting it. But avoidance, as his mother had spent a week demonstrating through sheer force of presence, was just a slower form of dying. Ji-hoon drove. The Seoul traffic was its usual apocalyptic self. Hyunwoo sat in the back seat and watched the city he'd once commanded slide past the window. The Hankang Group Tower in Yeongdongpo, the restaurants where he'd closed deals, the streets he'd driven down in a car that cost more than most people's apartments, back when driving was something his body allowed. They arrived in Itaewon at 6:45. The home plate kitchen was in a narrow commercial building between a laundromat and a stationery shop, the kind of location that announces itself through smell rather than signage. The window was steamed. Through the glass, the warm light of a kitchen in full operation, the movement of bodies working in coordinated rhythm. Ji-hoon unloaded the wheelchair, helped Hyun-woo transfer, wheeled him to the entrance. Then he stepped back. I'll be in the car. Hyun-woo sat at the entrance of a small restaurant kitchen in Itaewon, in a wheelchair, in a city of 10 million people, and felt more exposed than he had ever felt in his life. This was not a boardroom. There was no strategy, no leverage, no power dynamic to exploit. There was only a door, and behind it, a woman he had hurt, and in his lap, a container. Inside the container was cornbread. He had made it himself. It had taken 3 hours. His mother had supervised, mostly by sitting at the kitchen counter, offering no help whatsoever, and watching with the serene satisfaction of a woman whose plan was working. His hands had trembled through every step. Measuring the cornmeal was an exercise in chaos, more on the counter than in the bowl. Cracking eggs required a technique he'd invented on the spot, bracing the egg against the bowl's rim with his palm since his fingers couldn't apply targeted pressure. The batter was lumpy. The oven temperature was approximate. The result was, objectively, terrible. Burned at the edges, underdone in the center. Too much salt, not enough sugar. But he had made it. With hands that couldn't hold a pen. With a body that had taken everything from him. He had stood, not literally, but in every way that mattered, in a kitchen for 3 hours, and made something for another person. Not because it would be good, but because the act of making it was the message, and the message was, I thought about you. While my hands shook and the cornmeal spilled and the oven ran too hot, I thought about you. The way you think about me when you put turmeric in the broth and don't mention it. Amma saw him first. She was carrying a crate of sweet potatoes from the storage area to the prep station when she passed the front entrance and stopped. The man from the penthouse, in a wheelchair, at their door, holding a container in his lap with hands that visibly shook. She looked at him for a long 3 seconds, assessing, measuring, deciding. And then she set down the crate, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked to the back of the kitchen where Zuri was plating an order. She didn't say anything. She just looked at Zuri, then looked toward the door. Zuri followed her gaze. Through the pass-through window, past the steam and the tickets clipped to the rail, she could see the entrance. She could see him. Amma picked up the crate of sweet potatoes and carried it in the other direction, away from the front of the kitchen, giving Zuri a wide, clear path and saying nothing, which, for Amma, was the loudest possible statement of support. Zuri untied her apron, hung it on the hook, walked through the kitchen, past the sauté station, past the prep table, past the hand-washing sink and the fire extinguisher and the health department certificate on the wall. Each step a decision. Each step a choice to keep walking toward something that had hurt her and might hurt her again. She opened the door. The evening air was warm. Early June in Seoul, the light going golden, the street noise of Itaewon washing over them like a tide, conversations in 6 languages, scooter engines, someone's music from an upstairs window. The ordinary soundtrack of a city that didn't know this moment was happening. He was there, in the wheelchair, the container in his lap. His coat was heavier than the weather required. She recognized it as armor, the kind you wear when you're going somewhere that frightens you, and you want at least 1 layer between yourself and the world. He looked up at her. She looked down at him. And for a moment, neither of them spoke. Because the silence between 2 people who have hurt each other and are standing at the threshold of something fragile is not empty. It's full. It's crowded with everything that was said and shouldn't have been, and everything that should have been said and wasn't. He lifted the container. His hands shook. The lid rattled against the base with a small, persistent tremor that he couldn't control and didn't try to hide. I made this. 2 words. No preamble. No apology. No carefully constructed speech. He'd tried to write one answer, in the car, on the way over, but his hands wouldn't cooperate with the pen, and his mind wouldn't cooperate with the words, and somewhere between Gangnam and Itaewon, He'd realized that the speech was just another wall, another layer of performance between himself and the raw, unprotected truth. It's terrible. The edges are burned and the middle is, I think the word is raw, but that might be generous. I used too much salt. I don't know how that happened because I measured it, but my hands... He stopped. Started again. I wanted you to know that someone was thinking about you while they made something. I don't know if that matters, but I wanted you to know. Zuri looked at the container. She could see through the clear lid. The cornbread inside was exactly as described. A disaster. Burned dark at the edges, pale and sunken in the center, with a crack running through the middle where it had cooled unevenly. It was, without question, the worst cornbread she had ever seen. Her grandmother would have used it as a doorstop. She took the container from his hands. Their fingers touched during the transfer, his trembling, hers steady. The contact lasted 2 seconds. 3. Neither of them pulled away. She opened the lid, broke off a piece from the edge, the most burned part, the part that would taste like charcoal and regret. She put it in her mouth, chewed, swallowed. Next time, less salt. 3 words. And in those 3 words, everything. Not forgiveness. Forgiveness is a transaction. And this was bigger than a transaction. It was a door left open. A future tense. Next time. The implicit promise that there would be a next time, that the story hadn't ended, that the worst cornbread in Seoul was not a period, but a comma. He laughed. The same rusty, unpracticed, ugly, beautiful laugh from months ago. The one that surprised them both. The one that sounded like a lock being picked by someone who didn't know what they were doing but was trying anyway. She laughed too, and the sound of their laughter mixed with the street noise of Itaewon and rose into the warm evening air and dissolved into the city. And somewhere, in the invisible architecture of the universe, something shifted. Not dramatically, not with thunder or revelation, just a small, quiet click, like a bone settling back into its joint, like a door that had been stuck finally swinging open. She pulled up a chair from inside, one of the mismatched chairs that surrounded Homeplate's tiny customer counter, and sat down beside him on the sidewalk. They sat there for a while, not talking, watching the foot traffic, sharing the worst cornbread in the history of baking. He told her about his mother's arrival, about Ji-hoon's speech, about the 5 days of being slowly, lovingly dismantled by a woman who stood 5'2" and carried the emotional force of a natural disaster. She told him about the 3 weeks, about the containers she'd packed with the same care even when she was angry, even when the notes had stopped, because the food was never about him. It was about the standard, about the promise she'd made to herself and to her grandmother's memory that every meal she sent into the world would carry intention, regardless of whether the recipient deserved it. But I missed you. The words arrived plainly, without performance. The way you state a fact that you've decided is too important to dress up. I missed you too. The words came out the way a man's first confession does after 35 years of not making one, clumsily, without practice, slightly too loud, slightly too fast, but honest in a way that made their imperfection the whole point. They didn't kiss that night. They didn't need to. Some moments are complete without escalation. Some moments are the thing itself, not a step toward something else, but the destination. The reconstruction happened slowly, the way all real things happen, without montage, without soundtrack, without the compression that stories use to skip over the tedious, essential, unglamorous work of 2 people learning to be in each other's lives without destroying what they're building. He came to Homeplate twice a week. Ji-hoon drove him. At first he stayed outside. The wheelchair, the narrow kitchen, the practical impossibility of navigating a commercial cooking space from a seated position. But Zuri rearranged. Not for him. She was clear about that. For accessibility. For the business. But the new prep counter happened to be at wheelchair height, and the new pathway between the stations happened to be wide enough for his chair. And Amma watched the renovations, with the knowing silence of a woman who had seen this movie before and was choosing not to comment. He learned, not cooking. His hands weren't ready for that, not yet. But tasting. Zuri taught him to taste the way she'd been taught. Not with the palate of a consumer, but with the attention of a maker. What's missing? What's too much? Where the balance tips. He had the analytical mind for it, and the obsessive attention to detail that had made him a brilliant CEO translated, surprisingly and beautifully, into an intuitive understanding of flavor architecture. She told him his palate was annoyingly good for someone who ate takeout for a decade. He told her that her cornbread recipe needed a structural revision. The argument lasted 3 days and ended with a new recipe that was, they both admitted privately and never aloud, better than either original. At the penthouse, things shifted. Ji-hoon noticed first. He always noticed first. Hyunwoo started using his name. Not Ji-hoon-si, with the formal distance of an employer, but Ji-hoon, with the weight of a man who was, for the first time, acknowledging the human being behind the title. Small things followed. A question about Ji-hoon's weekend, an acknowledgement of the work he'd done during the birthday preparations, a quiet, unprompted thank you that landed in the kitchen one Tuesday evening and sat there, glowing, unprecedented. Ji-hoon didn't make a big deal of it. He loaded the dishwasher and allowed himself, for the first time in 7 years, to believe that the man he worked for was becoming the man he'd always hoped was in there. Soonja went back to Busan after 3 weeks. She left under protest, her own, but Hyunwoo called her every other day instead of waiting for her Sunday calls, and the conversations were different now. Longer, messier, real. He told her about the physiotherapy, honestly, including the setbacks. He told her about Zuri, honestly, including the fear. She told him about his father. Stories he'd never heard, details he'd never asked for because asking would have meant admitting he needed them. The board situation resolved not with a battle, but with a restructuring. Hyunwoo, with the help of a legal team he'd hired quietly, appeared at a board meeting in late June, in person, in the wheelchair. The room, 12 people around a glass table on the 42nd floor of the Hong Kong Tower, went silent when he entered. Dong-hyun's carefully rehearsed expression of welcome couldn't quite cover the alarm underneath. Hyunwoo didn't fight for control. That was the move no one expected, and it was the one that changed everything. He proposed a restructuring that diluted his own authority while protecting the employees he'd spent years ignoring. Enhanced severance policies, mental health benefits, a mandatory cap on consecutive working hours, paid parental leave that couldn't be revoked by a manager's whim. The proposal was elegant, legally airtight, and morally unassailable. Voting against it would have been a PR catastrophe. And Dong-hyun, who was many things, but not stupid, recognized a checkmate when he saw one. The measures passed unanimously. Hyunwoo left the building afterward and did not look back. Ji-hoon drove. They didn't go to the penthouse. They went to Itaewon, to a narrow kitchen between a laundromat and a stationery shop, where a woman was waiting with short ribs and an opinion about his board presentation that he hadn't asked for and desperately wanted to hear. 6 months later, on a Sunday morning in December, Hyunwoo Kang stood at a prep counter in the new home plate kitchen and cut vegetables. Stood, on his own legs. With a cane hooked over the counter's edge within reach, because the standing lasted 20 minutes on good days and 12 on bad ones, and today felt like a 15-minute day. The neurologist called it significant functional recovery, a phrase that sounded clinical and bloodless and failed entirely to capture what it felt like to stand in a kitchen and hold a knife and cut a carrot into pieces that were only slightly uneven. His hands still trembled. They probably always would. The neurologist had been honest about that. The nerve damage wasn't complete, but it wasn't gone either. He would never sign his name the way he used to. He would never hold a pen with the commanding precision that had once authorized billion-1 decisions. But he could hold a knife. He could chop, slowly, carefully, with the focused attention of a man who understood that the thing he was cutting was not the point. The point was that he was here, standing, making something, in a kitchen that smelled like sesame oil and corn flour, and the particular warmth that accumulates in a room where people cook together. The new kitchen was bigger. Not by much. Homeplate was never going to be a chain, and Zuri had no interest in scaling beyond what she could personally oversee. But the second space, opened in September, had a proper dining counter and a prep area that was, by design, fully accessible. The investment came from Hyunwoo, but the terms came from Zuri, a formal partnership, equal equity, documented in a contract they'd argued over for 2 weeks, and signed together at the kitchen counter on a Tuesday night with Amma as witness and Ji-hoon providing unsolicited legal commentary. Zuri was at the stove, adjusting the heat under a pot of doenjang jjigae, Soonja's recipe, taught to her during a 3-day visit from Busan that had involved extensive instruction, mild argument, and the kind of bonding that only happens when two strong-willed women decide to respect each other. Soonja had tasted Zuri's gochujang fried chicken during that visit, eaten 3 pieces without comment, and then asked for the recipe. From Soonja, this was the equivalent of a marriage blessing. "You're cutting those too thick." Zuri said it without looking up from the stove. She could hear the rhythm of the knife. She'd learned to read his hand strength by the pace and pressure of his cuts, the way a musician reads tempo. Slower and heavier meant the tremor was winning. Today was somewhere in the middle. They're rustic. They're chunks. Rustic chunks. "It's a style." "It's not a style, Hyunwoo. It's a motor skill issue disguised as an aesthetic choice." He smiled. The smile came easily now, not the controlled, strategic expression he'd deployed in boardrooms, but the real one, the slightly crooked one that appeared when he was caught off guard by something true. It had taken months to unearth, months of Zuri's honesty, of his mother's love, of Ji-hoon's quiet steadiness, of physiotherapy sessions that left him exhausted and trembling and, millimeter by millimeter, more capable than the day before. The door opened. Ji-hoon, carrying a box of produce from the morning market, complaining about traffic in Itaewon with the theatrical exasperation of a man who has been complaining about this specific traffic for 3 years and has no intention of stopping. Behind him, Soonja, visiting for the weekend, carrying a smaller bag of ingredients she'd brought from Busan because she didn't trust the ginger in Seoul markets. The ginger here has no conviction. It's decorative. "Iomeonim, the ginger is fine." "The ginger is not fine. I'll show you ginger with character. This is Busan ginger. It has opinions." Amma emerged from the storage room with a clipboard, nodded at the arrivals without pausing her inventory count, and went back to work. She and Soonja had developed a relationship that existed entirely in gestures and food exchanges. Neither spoke the other's language with any fluency, but they communicated with the effortless precision of 2 women who had decided they understood each other and considered the matter settled. The kitchen was full of voices, of steam, of the organized chaos of people preparing food together. Full in a way the penthouse had never been. Not with the performative fullness of a dinner party arranged for people who didn't want to come, but with the real, messy, loud fullness of people who had chosen to be here, who showed up not because they were invited, but because this was where they belonged. Hyunwoo set down the knife. His hands were trembling more now. 15 minutes was optimistic today. 12 was the reality. He reached for the cane, shifted his weight, felt the familiar protest of legs that worked but never forgot they'd once stopped. Zuri appeared beside him, not rushing, not hovering, just present, and adjusted the cutting board so he could reach it from the stool she'd placed at exactly the right height 6 months ago. He sat, resumed cutting. The carrots were, objectively, chunks. He knew it. She knew it. They both knew the other knew. Still too thick. Still rustic. She nudged his shoulder with hers, gentle, brief, the kind of casual contact that only exists between people who have earned it. He leaned into the nudge for half a second. A small thing. The smallest thing. And like all the smallest things in this story, it meant everything. He used to measure his life in quarterly reports and market share, in acquisition targets and year-over-year growth and the brutal, beautiful metrics of a man who believed that significance was a math problem, and the answer was always more. Now he measured it differently, in meals shared, in hands that shook but still reached, in the woman who had walked into his silence carrying comfort food and refused to leave it quiet, in the mother who had crossed the country in 12 hours to remind him that pride is a poison when you drink it alone, in the assistant who had waited 7 years to say the thing that needed to be said and said it perfectly, in the kitchen that was too small, too loud, too crowded with people who had opinions about ginger and carrot thickness and everything else. He still couldn't make cornbread. Not well, anyway. But he tried every Sunday, and every Sunday, Zuri ate it, even the burned parts, even the parts that were too salty. She ate it because the making was the point, the trembling hands and the spilled cornmeal, and the 3 hours of patient, stubborn effort by a man who had once believed that effort was something you demanded from others, never something you offered yourself. And on this Sunday morning in December, in a kitchen in Itaewon that smelled like doenjang and cornflour and Busan ginger with opinions, Hyunwoo Kang was not the CEO of anything. He was not the man in the wheelchair, although the wheelchair was folded in the corner, ready when he needed it. He was not the diagnosis, or the prognosis, or the quarterly report, or the empty table. He was a man in a kitchen, cutting carrots too thick, surrounded by people who stayed. Not because they had to. Not because they were paid to. Not because they feared him or needed him or wanted something from him. Because they chose to. Every single day. They chose to. And that, the choosing, the showing up, the being there for no reason except the simple, extraordinary, world-altering reason that you want to be. That was the thing he had spent 35 years building empires to avoid discovering. That the smallest table, the one set for the people who actually come, is the only one that matters. If this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. And tell me in the comments, what's the smallest thing someone ever did for you that changed everything? I'll see you in the next story.